Yes, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone joining us today for this webinar. We would like to thank Dr. Alexander Hartwig, our invited speaker, the EAGE Technical Community on Basin and Petroleum Systems Analysis for organizing this event, and all of you for being here. Sorry. We hope that you enjoyed the session and learned a lot. And with that, I hand it over to you, Friedman.
Thanks. Yeah, welcome everyone online. Today is our first Subsurface Systems Modeling webinar in 2026. And yeah, so this webinar is organized by the technical community called Basin and Petroleum Systems Analysis. And yeah, the main act today, also my name is Friedemann Bauer, and but the main person today is, of course, Alexander Hartwig. He will talk about regional scale basin modeling and how they can be used to investigate, let's say, natural hydrogen generation and solubility. So before we go to the presentation, just give a little introduction into EAGE, the technical community, and our activities. So in general, we are a network of people who are interested in sharing technical knowledge, specifically about basin and petroleum systems analysis, geochemistry, but also any sort of geosystems for decarbonization. And so it's really more about a higher frequent exchange of technical knowledge than an annual meeting or maybe a dedicated conference once in a blue moon. We have quite a few members, and on the lower right here is a QR code. And if you want to join the community, you can go there, and it's a LinkedIn account, and you can join, and then you will get information about our activities and see what webinar series and what events are happening. So who is running this community? It's this group of people here. We are kind of petroleum systems analysts mostly across the industry and academia, and yeah, we constantly there's always people coming and leaving, and so if you're very eager to be actively involved in helping to make this community a success, and feel free to reach out to us. One thing this community organizes is this specific webinar series. We had already a few events. And if here's a little outlook in what you can expect over the next months, so particularly in 2026. We have topics covering something like pressure modeling, hydrate systems, heat flow, something about Suriname, CCS. So there's a wide variety of different topics covering geochemistry, basin modeling, and lower carbon applications. Again, if you can go to this QR code and get more information. All right. I guess you all have heard about the annual conference. The deadline for the normal abstracts was already in February, not in January. But I guess if you want to register for a reduced fee, then you should have May 15th in mind. Again, here QR code if you want to go to the technical program. This community is actually hosting 3 dedicated sessions. They're listed here. Important for those ones is that you can still submit an abstract to these dedicated technical sessions. The deadline is February 10th. And you don't need a 2 to 4 page long abstract. You only need, I think, something like 400 words. I got that information just before this meeting, so hopefully it's correct. So yeah, and so the topics are, one is more focusing on integration of geochemistry, petroleum systems throughout the life cycle. The other one is geothermal, and another one is fluid flow transport mechanisms. So all of them are very interesting, and hope you will participate. The last announcement, and I'm really excited about that, is we have a dedicated Basin and Petroleum Systems Modeling conference here in Houston. First time for many, many years. And yeah, again, QR code up in the upper right corner. The deadline for submissions is August 10th. We will cover all the typical topics for Basin Petroleum Systems Analysis, plus something hopefully about, let's say, not the new technologies like AI, machine learning, but also lower carbon technologies. So this conference is in November. Hope you can all make it. And with that, we can go back and listen to Alexander, who will talk to us about basin modeling and hydrogen generation solubility. Thank you. And I will be also there to help with answering questions and managing the questions later on. So you feel free to drop a question in the chat or raise your hand later on, and you can. I will then call you, and then you can speak up. Well, with that, Alex, I give it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Friedemann, and thank everybody for joining today. Let's go ahead and share. All right, so I think you're all seeing my screen now.
Yes, we do.
And super. So just really quickly, you've heard the title. So the topic is about natural hydrogen and basin modeling applications to investigate that. And on the original invitation, it was me as, let's say, the main author, but there are other people who have contributed. And actually, in the last minute, decided to include Chris Boreham and Diane Edwards from Geoscience Australia, as potentially co-authors, because they've provided so much background and feedback into this sort of topic or this modeling project that I'm going to present to you. That's probably the best way to acknowledge their input. But I also would like to acknowledge Nick Marstedt, my colleague, who gave me some early insights and feedback on kinetics and also hydrogen kinetics. I asked him on whether things are possible to model easily or more complex, and he shared his insight on that, which helped me focus on certain pathways and not to waste too much time on others. And then also we had the opportunity to work with project partners on hydrogen-related projects, and their feedback and discussions have been really insightful to this type of work. All right. So I will just cover a very quick introduction on natural hydrogen, so to make sure we're all on the same page, and then go into the first big part of the presentation, which is on the actual modeling and the approach that we have at Geosphere. We call it the Pathfinder approach. And then the, let's say, second half will focus on the Cooper Basin example in Australia. And there we will focus a bit more on the model versus the data. And the big benefit we have with this project and data set is that most of it is public data. So it's something that, after this meeting, you could go and try and investigate yourself. And, that makes for, a good case study, but also for a nice presentation, because there aren't too many things that are kept confidential. And then we'll go into a summary. But before I head into this, I have a couple of questions that you can think about while I go through this presentation. And number one is, what do you think is the ultimate goal for modeling natural hydrogen? What's your opinion on that? Which risks would need to be addressed? And everybody has different opinions, but that's something to keep in mind in any modeling exercise. What are you trying to answer? And then, of course, the advantages of different modeling approaches, all the way from 1D to 3D reactive transport modeling. Everything has their pros and cons. And, what do you think about that? And of course, if you have any ideas for improvement, I'm happy if you would share them with me. All right, hydrogen. So why are we looking into it? Traditionally, hydrogen has been used in the heavy industry, so mostly in refining and let's say steel smelting, etc. For example, just on the laser pointer, and the IEA, has tracked its usage or demand, and in the past years it has been close to 100 million tons per year what the demand is. and it's been sourced from traditional sources. We'll say what that is on the next slide. The outlook is that to reach our net zero targets, we need to use more hydrogen very quickly, be more imaginative in how we use it. So we have to widen its application and add in some new sources of hydrogen. And if you look at where hydrogen is being used, it sort of reflects on where you have, refining and heavy industry. So it's no big surprise, but that's something that has been, going on for a long time. We then want to understand, okay, what is the impact of hydrogen with regard to greenhouse gas emissions? So here's a figure from Rystad Energy from 2021, and it basically shows of the carbon dioxide emissions that we have globally, which parts of that or which industries can be addressed by hydrogen. So those are shown in purple. And dark purple are those where, one could say this is where hydrogen is already being used. And if you were able to use more hydrogen as a fuel, or during the process, you could really reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's, again, refining, especially in the energy sector, then the chemicals and metals industry, and potentially in marine fuels and maybe even in aviation. There are, of course, other use scenarios in heating and other industrial processes where you could use hydrogen as an energy carrier, but that would require a bit more effort, and it's a bit debatable whether that will ever happen or not, or whether it will happen in the near future. So that's where the potential is. The question then is, okay, what's the cost and how scalable is it? And that's where we can go to the hydrogen rainbow, which you probably have heard of, and it works in a way that, yes, ultimately we want to have hydrogen as the output or the energy carrier, but there are different fuels or processes that go into generating that hydrogen. And we have the traditional processes, which are called black and gray hydrogen, where we have coal or natural gas steam reforming to get hydrogen, and that comes with a very high greenhouse gas footprint, and costs are probably manageable. Let's say the update to gray hydrogen is blue hydrogen. That's by including carbon capture and storage to sequester the CO2 and therefore reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. Costs, of course, are a little bit higher, but it's something that is being considered. There's something called pink hydrogen that uses nuclear power to do electrolysis of water, which is also something that happens in nature. But that, of course, comes with all the pros and cons of nuclear power. Cost could be high. The cost here probably reflects nuclear waste management. And then we have a part of the industry that is rapidly growing, and that is green, or usually it's called green hydrogen. The color yellow comes up if you use solar power, but the idea is that you use renewable energy sources to run electrolyzers to generate hydrogen. It comes with very low greenhouse gas emissions, probably almost zero, but the cost is still an issue. So the question is it possible to reduce cost for hydrogen production to make them more competitive against the more traditional uses? And then, of course, is the aspect that we're really interested in, and that's the white or gold hydrogen, which is naturally occurring hydrogen, similar to what we know from natural gas. It exists in the subsurface, and we want to produce it by drilling wells or even by maybe stimulating it to increase productivity or hydrogen generation. And ideally, that comes at a very low greenhouse gas cost or emissions, almost zero, and maybe at low cost if the quantities are large enough. And so today we will be focusing on this white or gold hydrogen. All right, here's a map, and you've probably seen similar maps before. In the background, all these little dots are observations of hydrogen that were for a large part collected by Zgonic in 2020. And then I added in some more sources listed in IEA and things that I came across, but it's already outdated. So this is from half a year ago. But you can see that hydrogen has been observed in a number of settings, in different geologic settings, in well bores, mining, as surface seeps, many different places. There are also a lot more observations on the southern hemisphere. I just don't have all of them on my map. So it's been present for quite a long time and been investigated. There's also an initiative by the Deep Time Digital Earth community, which is trying to get let's say, a global or public model for hydrogen data. And their working group is called H2WANA. And that group is dedicated to collecting this type of data, but also models, and to promote research on this topic. So with all these observations of hydrogen, of course, companies and people have started to explore for that. So the yellow stars show places where exploration drilling is ongoing or has been ongoing for 2 years almost. And there are also places where scientific drilling is ongoing in the world. And both of these, give us some new data and some new things to think about. And it's also the exploration is where the money is going, the venture capital, which is really driving some of the hype behind hydrogen exploration. At the same time, if you have exploration, you need licensing rounds, and they have been announced in a couple of places, even where we don't yet have any, let's say, documented drilling, but where hydrogen has been observed, reported on, and where there's an interest in it, usually related to some sort of maybe mining activities. And last but not least, we at Geosphere had the wonderful opportunity to work on a number of projects, also globally, to help maybe bring this a step further, at least in terms of understanding. And this is part of that is what I'm going to share with you today. So natural hydrogen, what are the main sources and migration concepts? The figure that you see here has been updated and modified a couple of times, but basically what it shows is, let's say, a continental basement setting with sedimentary layers, and then different reactions that can create hydrogen. The most interesting are usually the water-rock reactions. So that's in one part radiolysis, so radioactive decay of uranium, thorium, potassium, do sort of the split water molecules to then generate free hydrogen. We also have reactions with mafic rocks, best if it's olivine, so very iron-rich, where iron reacts with water to then oxidize the iron and release hydrogen. There are other processes, for example, thermogenic hydrogen that can be generated from coals or organic matter at high maturities. There's biogenic hydrogen that the microbes in the shallow subsurface produce and sometimes also consume, not themselves, but the other microbes. And there's, of course, drilling-induced hydrogen due to oxidation or mechanochemical processes during drilling, drill bit metamorphism. So all of these different processes generate hydrogen. And depending on what the generation process is, migration can look a little bit different, happens at different time scales. And the fate of hydrogen is one of the big questions. How easy is it to trap hydrogen once it's been generated and released? One example that you might have heard about is the mid-continent drift area in the United States. So that's roughly here. In the background, you see a map that was published by German et al. From the USGS, and it shows hydrogen prospectivity. And where the colors are dark, that's where you might have high prospectivity. Where they're light, it's lower prospectivity. And the MCR is one area where it's an ancient drift where hydrogen prospectivity is high, or at least it's perceived high, and where a lot of the drilling activity is happening. You will notice that a lot of hydrogen observations, so up to 25 mole% in the gas, are observed in other areas, but that's usually related to where hydrocarbon or water wells have been drilled. So these observations of hydrogen reflect where hydrocarbon wells traditionally have been drilled. They don't capture all of the other wellbores that might be interesting or may have measured hydrogen but never reported it to any public repositories. If we zoom in on Kansas, there's an area in eastern Kansas where this mid-continent drift passes through the state, where historically a couple of wells have reported high hydrogen content. So the oldest ones are Heinz and Scott, somewhere between 20 and 40% hydrogen in the gas phase. These were not hydrocarbon wells, but they didn't find any hydrocarbons. They found water and hydrogen instead. And then more recently, a well called Suderosh, which reported up to 90% hydrogen. So what's happening there? If you look at a cross section from west to east through the Kansas area, you have the, let's say, Rocky Mountain foothills, where rainwater enters the subsurface and the aquifers, gets down all the way down to the basal Cambrian aquifers that are lying on top of the basement. And there, this fresh water picks up hydrogen that is being generated either by radiolysis or by serpentinization of oceanic crust that was in place during the mid-continent drift. And then this water transports further to one of the basement highs, the Nimaha uplift, where then it might exsolve or accumulate in a trap. At least that's the idea. And that's where wells have reported high amounts of hydrogen. And recent exploration drilling basically focuses on these areas of these historic wells and sort of twins them, but applies more geology and some exploration concept behind it to test different ideas. Having said that, the story is not that simple. So Guyard et al. In 2017 published a study which sampled these wells over longer periods of time. So they looked at water samples and gas samples over almost a decade and looked at the hydrogen content. And if you take, for example, this Suderosh well, high hydrogen values in the beginning, but then with time and subsequent sampling, hydrogen fluctuates quite significantly. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's gone. And that depends quite a bit on the wellbore conditions, how long water has been standing in the wellbore, has there been any microbial activity, etc. And the same is observed in these other wells, that initially you report a certain amount of hydrogen, but with subsequent measurements, they fluctuate through time, sometimes more, sometimes less. But it's just to emphasize that one hydrogen measurement is not indicative of the actual system. What is interesting, though, is that no matter how active the system is, we see some sort of recharge effects with the aquifer, and this is exciting. And it shows that this transport of hydrogen is happening at human timescales, not just geologic timescales. Another example, which is the one we will be focusing on, is the Cooper Basin in Australia. And the Cooper Basin is the principal onshore gas and condensate producing province in Australia. It's been explored for a very long time. And it's basically a stack of several basins. So the Cooper Basin is this Paleozoic basin at the base of the sedimentary cross-section, and it's overlain by the Eromanga Basin, which is also part of the Great Artesian Basin in Australia. But what is interesting there, hydrogen gas shows, so to say, were reported near the coals in this deep basin. And that initiated a study by Borum et al. In 2023, which said, okay, well, if hydrogen and coal occur in the same place, are coals for this thermogenic hydrogen, is that the source are coals the source for hydrogen? And they tested the H2ORT kinetics, which were developed by my colleagues, Brian and Nick here at Geosphere, and tested them and then applied them. And they found that if you look at how much hydrogen was generated in the center of the basin, so at high maturity, those amounts are equal to, let's say, the gas that was generated in the deep basin. So there seems to be a huge hydrogen potential associated to coals. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Now, before I get into our approach, I just want to let everybody know we're not the only ones doing this. So hydrogen modeling has been, has mushroomed. So there are many actors, many different solutions. And they're a mix of either existing technology that is being adapted to this new, let's say, topic. That's what I'm doing. And there are also dedicated new tools that are being developed by certain groups. All in all, we all benefit from a lot of open data and legacy research on hydrogen, which wasn't much in the spotlight for maybe 20 years, but is really which has picked up now. But we also benefit from modern data science. There are AI tools that really help to generate fast progression. So it's really fast development, and I'm quite fascinated by that. Just to show some examples, for example, the Petromod software is being used to model cross sections in the Paris Basin and look at hydrogen flow. A similar study has been conducted in the Taranaki Basin in New Zealand just recently and just been published. Again, applying a hydrogen source model and then looking at gas migration and the influence of faults and where that would accumulate. Another example is from IFP, the ArcTem software that they use can be used to model hydrogen flow along faults and together with water and investigate other dissolved species. So that's one possibility. Terranta have their software which can model hydrogen and water flow and do visualizations, accommodate complex structure as well. So there are lots of possibilities and opportunities to model hydrogen, and really the key is to figure out, okay, what's the target audience? Is it research, industry, or consulting? And everybody has different needs and budgets. And I think we're seeing that, therefore, there are different solutions, and we'll have to see which ones are the ones that are, people will be using. And so, but there are many more, and it's it's interesting to follow and to discuss. All right. At Geosphere, we used, let's say, Pathfinder workflow, and the idea behind that is to do stepwise modeling, right? We want to keep it simple. The uncertainties are high on this hydrogen topic. There are also some, let's say, discrepancies in some of the models that are being published. So, we don't know everything for certain. But what we can say is that, for example, generation, there it's important to understand how much is generated, where and when. And usually that's a kinetic or rate function, and it depends on temperature, time, and source quality. Source quality depends on your source. Is it your radiogenic nuclei? Is it iron content or TOC? And then we also have the aspect of water-rock ratio, so porosity for the basement interactions. The next step is to look at explosion. So how does hydrogen leave its source rock? In most cases, especially for the basement sources, it's the solubility in pore fluid that is key to say or to understand. And that is, again, dependent on pressure, temperature, and porosity. So that's something we traditionally model in basin models. Then there are other questions like adsorption of minerals and kerogen, co-adsorption with other gases, tectonic release mechanisms that need to be worked through. And there is literature available on that, especially from the hydrogen storage community. But again, you need to do some filtering and figure out how to apply that to the exploration or basin modeling setting. And then the transport, so the migration, that's what we're interested in. How does your hydrogen get from source to a reservoir? And again, it's solubility in the carrier or pore fluid. It's temperature, pressure, salinity dependent. And what we're really interested in is this bubble point. So where does hydrogen leave the aqueous transport and maybe move over into free gas transport? Because that would really help us get high hydrogen concentrations in the subsurface, which then could be targeted by exploration drilling. And then in the end, it's the preservation risk. Hydrogen is reactive, it's a small molecule, and it doesn't move exactly the same way as methane, which we're more used to modeling and following. But again, there are scavengers along the migration path, so bioutilization plays a role, sorption processes, residence time, and you need to understand what the seals are. And all of that can be looked at step by step. And the idea behind that is, as I said, there's so much uncertainty by focusing on parameters that we can constrain, measure, and then say, okay, this is the distribution of a parameter, and this is what we're going to apply. And anything beyond that, is going to be difficult to constrain. So we'll try to avoid any black boxes. Thermogenic hydrogen. So now we're going to talk about the different sources. This H2ARC model was tested or measured on the Pachavara atolls from the Cooper Basin. That was one of the research projects, and also on one of the lacustrine shales in China, the Shaizhi Formation from the Songliao Basin. And what Nick and Brian found out is that if you run pyrolysis on these high mature organic matter, mature to high temperatures, you can start to generate hydrogen. And hydrogen generation co-occurs with late gas generation. So late gas generation is methane that is being liberated from high mature organic matter at about 2% RO. So roughly at the same maturity, hydrogen is being generated in the source rock. Then at about 3% RO, so at very high temperatures, hydrogen generation dominates, and this late gas starts to subside. And then overall, hydrogen generation probably ceases at very high temperatures around 5% RO. Interestingly, depending, regardless of the source rock, it's possible to generate about 20 milligrams of hydrogen per gram TOC. And the reason is that at such high maturity, this organic matter has been condensed so much that regardless of the beginning source rock, they sort of resemble each other, and they're just, very condensed carbon structures. On the other hand, there are others who have looked into hydrogen generation from coals, for example, Moretti et al. From a Colombian example, and they published a hydrogen kinetic, which is a bit more stable. So this is orange curve, which generates hydrogen at fairly high temperatures compared to what was modeled by us at Geosphere. But that is related to the type of kinetic modeling that is applied and the fitting of the lab experiments. And it's somewhat similar to what we're used to from carriaging kinetics. Depending on the lab philosophy or the approach, you get slightly different kinetics, but in the end, it's the modeler who has to choose which one is applicable to the study area. There's also a view by some other authors, Xiao and Gao, from last year, and they said, well, actually, it shouldn't be possible to generate significant amounts of hydrogen at high pressure and temperature, as we propose from this kinetic modeling. And they argue that thermodynamically, methane is much more stable, and therefore the hydrogen that's being generated isn't directly incorporated into methane, and therefore there isn't any hydrogen available. That's difficult to actually check. It's based on modeling, but it's, again, this discrepancy between lab experiments, computer modeling, etc., and very few real-world examples to look at. But it's something to keep in mind. So, there's still more work to do. We go to radiolysis. Radiolysis really depends on the amount of radioactive minerals in your rocks. That's usually, well, not minerals, but elements. That's usually uranium, thorium, and potassium. The process is quite well understood. One of the big factors is the availability of water, because that needs to be electrolyzed. So fracture porosity is important to understand and to model or to include. And one of the benefits is that this process also generates helium. And helium is less reactive in the subsurface. It's an inert gas, and that has been used as or described as a possible tracer for hydrogen migration. So therefore, this radiolysis process or model is quite interesting for hydrogen modeling to quantify hydrogen and helium at the same time. We use a model from Boram et al. From 2021. And basically, in our project, we looked at granitic basement in the area that is representative of what exists under the Cooper Basin, looked at the uranium, thorium, and potassium concentrations, calculate the rate for hydrogen generation, and apply that in our modeling. And then serpentinization. That's the difficult part. That's a very complex process. So here, serpentinization, I don't know how much you guys know about that, but it's, as I said, basically you have iron-rich mafic and ultramafic rocks, which react with water. The iron is oxidized, and then hydrogen is being released. It sounds simple, but it's very complex, because the chemical process depends on the mineralogy, the temperature, the porosity, and also the water chemistry of the rock. And it differs depending on your mineral composition. So for example, on the right-hand side, I have a plot of hydrogen that is being generated at different temperatures for different olivine rock compositions. So whether it's a firelite or phosphorite. So you can see there are, big differences on when hydrogen is being released and how much. The same thing if you go away from these olivines, so these very ultramafic rocks, to something that is more mafic, more representative of a typical basalt, like a pyroxene, you can see that generation rates are again smaller, or yields are smaller. And these plots show the amount of hydrogen that is being generated up to an equilibrium concentration before the reaction ends. So there's a chemical balance that needs to be kept, which at some point becomes inhibiting for hydrogen generation, because the chemical potentials shift. And instead of generating hydrogen, different minerals are being generated. And what's interesting is that all of these reactions are quite fast, and for on geologic timescales, they're instant. And one of the challenges again is it's often reported as a total yield per unit rock, and somehow you need to come up with a rate for modeling, for example. And there are high temperature reactions, so we differentiate between high temperature, so above 150 degrees Celsius, and low temperature reactions. The high temperature reactions are well understood for the most part. Low temperature reactions not so, but they are probably important for shallow basement and ophiolite complexes. So before you do any modeling, you need to figure out what type of a rock are you really dealing with. So if you look at the continuum of the basement rocks, right, you have granitic or felsic rocks, you have the gabbros and basalts, which are something we all know of, and then we have the olivines and ultramafic rocks, which are more reflective of oceanic crust. And they have different mineral compositions. And as I just pointed out, depending on their mineral composition, they will have different generation rates. So that's something that can be checked, but chemical or mineralogical analysis will guide you to that. Then there's another aspect, and that's the water-rock ratio. So a lot of the experiments that these models are built on were originally done for black smokers, at mid-oceanic ridges where the experiments come from, or a lot of the lab and modeling studies. And they usually work with water-rock ratios of 1. So you have a lot of water and a smaller amount of rock. But if we look at basement settings, we're looking at a lot of rock with very little water. So it's one of the challenges is to extrapolate these experimental rates from all of these different publications towards the water-rock ratios that are present in basement settings. So that's one of the challenges. And over the past 2 years, more and more studies have come out that try to look into that and to support that with field measurements. So that's also exciting to follow up with. So those were the generation models. The next one is, transport solubility. And as I mentioned, depending on your modeling software and let's say the modeling goal, there are different ways to do that. There are, flow path models, Darcy Flow in Petromod, in Taranta, etc. But if you don't use these softwares, how do you want to do that if it's not a, full 3D or a transport model? Well, one way is to look at solubility information water. So most basin models, most mapping softwares, can calculate a temperature, pressure, or you can come up with a salinity as an input model. And I chose the model by Kakashi et al., which published a model that is valid up to about 180 degrees Celsius and 1,000 megapascal and works over a wide range of salinities. So it's applicable to most sedimentary environments that we are working with. And the way it works is that it calculates a Henry constant for hydrogen based on temperature, pressure, etc. And all these graphs are a bit unwieldy and were a bit confusing in the beginning. But if you take one of them, the temperature dependent Henry's constant for hydrogen solubility, and you turn it around and it looks more like a depth trend. And if you then, change to degrees Celsius, that's something, that's much easier to work with. And from that, basically you can then calculate hydrogen solubility in your basin. And what's interesting to note here is that, it's not a, simple increase with depth type relationship, but depending on your salinity, there can also be a reversal in solubility of hydrogen in the shallow subsurface. So those things, these effects need to be kept in mind and investigated during modeling. And then almost last but not least, you have the sinks. So what happens with the hydrogen? Well, as I said, it can be used by microbes. And what's the limit of utilization? Maybe it's 80 degrees Celsius, as with biodegradation. Maybe it's a little bit higher, but it's somewhere around there. So that's something that we can incorporate in our thinking. We have reactions that remove hydrogen. There are reactions with pyrite or with sulfite, that end up being like TSR. And there's absorption on clay minerals and coal. And the storage community has come up with estimates of hydrogen absorption on coal. And here, ranges reported in mole per kilogram. What's interesting is organic matter has much higher absorption capacity for hydrogen than clay minerals, and that's something to keep in mind for modeling or when looking at seals and sinks. What's also interesting is that there's a preferential absorption order. So CO2 is preferentially absorbed before methane, before hydrogen. So hydrogen is at the end of the chain, and that might allow hydrogen to be more freely available on the subsurface than we might think intuitively. And also, hydrogen does not desorb carbon dioxide or methane in lab experiments. So that's probably also true in nature. So one last thought experiment before we go into the case study. So if you look at a basin history and think about compaction, porosity evolution, temperature evolution, fracturing, fluid flow events, and preservation of hydrogen. If we just look at a simple burial history that incorporates a couple of interesting tectonic moments, we're looking at a cratonic setting potentially, which is many millions of years going up and down and being reburied. If we start with thermogenic hydrogen, based on the kinetics, it actually, reacts very similar to what we would expect from hydrocarbon modeling. Transformation ratio increases during initial burial up to a certain point when uplift starts. That's when maturation stops. Generation stops, and it only gets reactivated once we've reached higher temperatures and deeper burial. For radiolytic hydrogen, it's a little bit different. There it's a radioactive decay that plays a role, and the generation rate really depends on the half-life and porosity. So with compaction, you decrease porosity, you reduce the amount of water, but the generation rates, the reaction keeps going as long as there's enough water available, and so it just keeps going. And transformation takes millennia, not millennia, giga years, billions of years. It's a long time. So this is a very long process. And then serpentinization, it's if anybody wants to make a guess, you have 2 seconds. Reacts different again. Since it's mostly temperature and chemistry dependent, it's a process that starts at very low temperatures. It's slow, but with increasing temperature, it becomes faster and generates more hydrogen up to a point, and even potentially during uplift, as long as there's water available in the system, the process could keep going. Maybe key here is that you generate new fracture paths, right? To expose new rock surfaces to this process, because at some point the chemical potential is exhausted. But overall, transformation rates are slow and probably continuous through time, but at different rates. So all three of these processes react different during burial, and that's something that one can investigate very well with these Basin models. So now for the last part, we're going to hop into the Cooper Basin and look at model versus data. Just a reminder on the architecture, you saw this cross-section before, and what we're going to focus on now is this red section. So this red section is the Pacharao Formation. It's the Permian. It's deep in the Cooper Basin, and it's overlain by the aquifers here in blue of the Great Artesian Basin with flow from, let's say, northeast to southwest. There's active water transport and flushing, but it doesn't always access the deep basin. With the temperature, pressure, and salinity data from our models and from our wells, we can then go ahead and calculate solubility. And that's what you see on the right-hand side. It's a map of hydrogen solubility in mole percent for the Pacharao Formation. And on top of it, I'm showing data points. So if you just look at the color for the moment, these are hydrogen mole percent gas, let's say, concentrations from DST tests and well. So these are actual DSTs, sometimes with gas flow to the surface, etc. And I've tried to keep the color bars similar. So as long as it's bluish, we're at very low concentrations, also on this map. And as soon as we get into reds and oranges, that's when you have high concentrations in the well that generally exceed solubility. And an easy way to look at that is by plotting the mole concentrations of hydrogen from the well versus what we predict at the well location or at the well, the sample depth. And there, anything in blue are low concentrations, which are probably representative of solution gas. But then you have some higher concentrations of gas which exceed solubility at the formation depth. And there is a chance that that is actually free gas that is available, or gas that is, got into this trap or this wellbore through some other process. What we also did here is to assign confidence levels, because we're lucky to have this many data points with hydrogen. But if you have that many, you have to say, okay, what's a good measurement? What's a bad measurement? And a good measurement in this case is if you had a DST with several tens of minutes of flow, or large amounts of gas to surface with hydrogen measured, in some cases even time series. So several samples from the same DST after 20-30 minutes that confirm hydrogen is still in the gas stream. And on the other spectrum, you have low confidence. Those are wells where we didn't have all the information to the DST, or where some other operational incident has cast doubt on the nature of the hydrogen, so it could be very likely drilling induced, etc. So we tried to classify that and to see, okay, which ones are the good measurements, which ones are the bad measurements, and that really helps in analysis. And then we apply our H2 org model and say, okay, generate hydrogen. The quantity maybe isn't so important at the moment. It's more interesting to see where the hydrogen is generated. It's in the deep part of the basin. A lot of the observations are somewhere else, but the wells drilled around this syncline, they show hydrogen, and that's, seems to be a good match. If you look at hydrogen through time, we can calculate, total transformation, or we can look at hydrogen generated since the last big basin event, which is on the right-hand side and coming on the next slide. So if you look at a burial history, and look at hydrogen generated through time, it probably started in Jurassic when burial was deep enough and the coals got hot enough. But in the meantime, there was an uplift event, an erosion event, a fluid flow event, which is documented in fluid inclusions and fracture fills. So there, any hydrogen that was accumulated has probably been, leaked to surface and the trap destroyed. So instead, we want to look at hydrogen generated since then. So when burial began again. And that amount of hydrogen is 10 times less, but still occurs over 60 million years. So we still get a significant amount of hydrogen if you later compare it to the other sources, but it's less than their entire potential. So we can say, well, with that hydrogen that is being generated and knowing what the storage capacity is, so using the solubility map plus a net reservoir volume, we can calculate the storage capacity of hydrogen of this Pachamara coal or the sandstone surrounding these coals. And then we can do a mass balance and say, okay, if we inject all of this hydrogen into the reservoir, when will the reservoir be saturated and where would we expect to see excess hydrogen? And that's shown on this map. So this area in red, deep in the basin center, that's one of the areas where you would expect to see an excess of hydrogen, so the highest potential to form free hydrogen. All these other areas here in blue, there, if you apply the H2ORC model, you wouldn't generate enough hydrogen to really saturate the reservoir fluids to then create excess hydrogen as is observed in some of these wells. So then, of course, there need to be other sources. One question is, okay, are all of these hydrogen shows bit burn or artifacts? Well, that could be. There's actually no way to distinguish. So that's one of the big caveats. But if we leave that out for a moment, we say, well, what about basement? So if we look at a cross-section here in the south in the basement, it's possible to, or we know that this Pachamara formation onlaps onto granitic basement, for example. And there, of course, would be a direct migration path from, radiolytic hydrogen up into the Pachamara formation. Okay, well, let's investigate basement rock. So one way to look to do that is to take all of the hydrogen measurements and then calculate the distance to basement. So on the left-hand side is the hydrogen concentration and on a log scale, and we have distance to basement from the sample depth. And if you squint and if you ignore some of these smaller low confidence points, you can see that some of these high confidence samples seem to appear to show an increase of hydrogen concentration with decreasing depth to basement. So, that's one indication that maybe basement plays a role, and, similar effects are seen in the helium concentrations, and that has been studied in great detail. So there's helium in this basin, which is sourced from the granites. So a hydrogen source makes sense as well. So where are these granites? They can be mapped with geophysical means. They're shown here in these gray dots. Okay, so we have granites. What about mafic rocks? They can be mapped with through magnetic susceptibility studies, and they can be shown on the map as well. So we have both sources, and we can put them on one map, and we can then say how much hydrogen is being generated by each one of them. And we can create a map for radiolysis, and we can create a map for serpentinization. And we can even combine these two maps, right? And what's interesting again to note is the scale of generation. So radiolytic generation, of course, happens over long periods of time, but at 10 times lower rates than low temperature serpentinization, for example, in this example. The big question is, what about all of these gaps in here where we don't have information? Well, there, it's the question which rock type dominates. The basement is present, but it's difficult to differentiate the two based on the geophysical properties, but it's probably generating hydrogen as well. Okay, What was interesting here, last comment, is to see that these hydrogen observations now do fall into areas where hydrogen can, in theory, be generated from the basement. So this adds up to be to be reasonable. Let's say this. Interesting thought experiment. How long would it take to saturate basement? So if you have 1 cubic kilometer of basement, how long would it take to self-saturate? If you use radiolysis, it would take hundreds of millions of years, so a billion year or more. In some areas, less due to higher porosity, but and faster generation. But with serpentinization, it's tens of millions of years. It's just more prolific, this process, and therefore, it's at the time scales of basin events. 60 million years since last uplift. So it's possible to generate, quite a bit of hydrogen from low temperature serpentinization to maybe saturate basement waters. Okay. Then, to start getting to the end, I see we're running short on time here. Let's look at some cross sections. And here I've just shown in yellow the aquifers, in brown the aquitards, where you don't have cross communication. And I'm showing wellbore calculations for hydrogen solubility. And the circle size shows, how much hydrogen can be dissolved, at that depth, temperature, salinity. On top of that, we can put our 80 degrees sort of biodegradation or bioutilization limit. And we can put on the maturity contours, high maturity in the basin center above these hot granites. And then on the next step, we can put on our hydrogen measurements. And here I'm just plotting size for concentration. And what you see is that here in the basin center, hydrogen generation in these colds maybe, is keeping up with solubility. So they're, on equal scales, and it's difficult to say whether there's any free hydrogen, but it's at least at the solubility limit. A lot of observations outside of the basin center, that is true too, but there are some wellbores which report high amounts of hydrogen, more than could be dissolved in the formation. So this is excess hydrogen potentially. But then more significantly, up on these basement highs, that's where wellbores report high amounts of hydrogen, far higher than formation solubilities at that point. So there is an indication that for some reason there's excess hydrogen there. Still, the question remains: is that operations related, or is that natural hydrogen? And difficult to prove, but at least if you think about migration and the migration focus, this is where the migration focus would be. One last cross section, maybe the most interesting one. To ask the question: is there any evidence for organic sourced hydrogen? And for that, we dive into the center of the basin and only look at high mature samples, which are very dry. So they have, they're mostly methane, CO2, and hydrogen that is reported from these wells. So they're, extremely dry samples. If we look at them in a cross section, we see that these colored dots, these are the same ones, usually occur at or below the 2% RO line. So these are the very dry samples. But there are other samples nearby, and you can say, well, how dry are they? Well, if circle size represents dryness, then again, the driest samples are out here, and these are lower concentration hydrogen and also mixed in with other gases. So the total gas is a lot wetter. And then, I mentioned, data confidence. What does that tell us? Well, turns out some of these deep measurements are not very high confidence, but others are. So, if we look at that and analyze the data, with these aspects in mind, we can say, well, yeah, maybe there's evidence for H2ORC. There are very mature dry gases in the basin center that fit the criteria, and they can be distinguished from other gases, even with high confidence. So there may be organic sourced hydrogen in the system, but it's difficult to differentiate if you don't use this type of an approach. All right, error bars. They're large, and I'm going to go, skip ahead. Basically, you can test, the different input variables and figure out, how much does your hydrogen volume change, with varying these parameters, and it can change significantly. You can make your source richer or poorer, that's standard. More interesting is maybe the solubility model. So here in the middle is a one-to-one line for the reference model, looking at the reference model solubility versus sensitivity testing, either higher salinity, higher thermal gradient, higher pressure, lower temperature, etc. And for shallow environments, maybe that doesn't make a big difference. Maybe it's a 5% error. Yeah, it's not too large. But the deeper you go, the larger the error gets, and it can be up to 20% depending how you set your thermal gradient. So there is quite a bit of an error to the solubility model, and that's something that needs to be tested. All right, I'm going to skip the challenges and go straight to the summary due to time. So, I showed you models for the, radiolysis, serpentinization, and H2-ORC, and, how their rates differ significantly, how the models differ, but how they can be applied together to interrogate data. We compared gas concentrations or hydrogen gas concentrations to their equilibrium brine solubility, and we saw that there seems to be excess gas in the system. But you need to be careful when looking at these shows and interpreting them. It's important to apply confidence levels and to get some sort of feel for the data validity. There's also this aspect of basement that needs to be included. It's present in a number of settings and we can model it. What's interesting to observe is that if you have your source at the base of a basement or of a basin, if you add hydrogen at the bottom, even if the water is saturated and 1% fracture porosity in basement, as soon as it gets in contact with 10% reservoir quality sandstones or poor reservoir quality, you get dilution. So it's very difficult to create high concentrations of hydrogen in sedimentary sections. And it's important to look at yields over time. And then, I hope I was able to convince you to some degree that, simple modeling and mapping can go a long way to investigate hydrogen migration dynamics, right, without actually modeling migration. And, we see this as a tool for basin scale screening. So it's an early exploration tool. But if if I can do one recommendation, if you measure gas, measure hydrogen as well and ask for isotopic analysis, because that can shed some light on where it's coming from. And all of the things that I've shown you now will soon be available in a much more comprehensive report through Geoscience Australia when the project is wrapped up. It's under review, and it will give more insight into the gas samples and interpretations of the gas as well. So thanks for your patience and attention.
Oh, thank you very much, Alex. That was a great presentation. Very clear slides. Clear message. No, thank you. I liked very much that you at the beginning threw out some questions. I think the questions were like, what's the goal? What are the risks? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of these different modeling approaches? And hopefully we can discuss that here. So it's a little, we are kind of a little tight on time, but I think we will probably go over. And if people have to drop out, they can probably look at the recording later on. One thing from my side, I'm really sorry, but I think I skipped or missed somehow Alex's bio slide. And so I just bring that up here quickly at the end. Sorry. I don't know. So while we did have the discussion, I keep that up. Yeah. So there are a few questions in the chat. I think one question was very early and maybe before you showed some of your actual model approaches, but the question was, why is hydrogen transport from source rock towards accumulation zones in the gaseous phase not considered in this study? I guess the question maybe, vapor phase, I guess, or as individual phase and mostly as in solution. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I think you need to differentiate between the sources. I know, for example, if we look at water-rock reactions in the basement, there's a point when, especially through radiolysis, enough hydrogen has been generated that even the water's solubility is exceeded, and then in theory you could create free hydrogen for migration. I think that could happen, and that's why it's important to understand how long would it take to actually saturate your basement fluid. How big is your fracture fluid network? Are you penetrating 100, 200 meters into your basement, a kilometer or 3? It depends a bit on your settings, and if you have a feel for that, then it's possible to investigate, okay, how long will it take to actually saturate that setting and to generate excess hydrogen. So that's in the basement setting. For the, let's say, organic source, too little research exists, but there are, for example, if you think about something more exotic, like basin-centered gas, for example, some people may have worked with that. There you have migration accumulation processes of natural gas, which are a little bit different than what you would expect in these normal pressure, not so deep or mature settings. And I imagine similar things could happen with hydrogen from organic sources. You're in such a deep place that yes, maybe hydrogen becomes available as gas phase initially, but then as soon as you leave the shale or the coal, you will be in contact with water, and then solubility does become a question again. So I think initially from source to the first carrier, once it reaches the first carrier, solubility is important to understand and to constrain before considering free phase flow.
Yeah. You have to overcome the solubility threshold first, and then you're pretty deep in high pressure, so you're probably supercritical. That makes it even a bit more complicated if you really want to understand the physics. And yeah, so many components. I guess the other question was like basically this Kakachi et al. Model that experimentally validated. I guess it was developed in labs first, right? Or so.
Yes, it's based on lab data and it builds on previous models. So it's an open access article. So I can send you a reference, or we can make it available somewhere, and you can follow up and read about it. So it is validated, to a certain degree that it's published. I cannot say whether it's the best model, but it builds on other models which give similar results. So it's for current purposes, it's definitely good enough.
Yeah. Well, the next questions actually maybe go together. I realized that you didn't show any isotopes, and maybe I missed it, but
No, I didn't.
So is there a way to isotopically distinguish between these sources, and then also, what do you think at the moment, or what's our understanding? Which of these processes are most important? Is that the serpentinization, radiolysis, thermogenic? I also have in my mind, okay, most of the data are probably coming from oil and gas wells, and so there are maybe in specific areas which are maybe not supporting the serpentinization locations much. So what's your overall thinking there, and maybe just a combination with the isotopes?
Yes. Unfortunately, the isotopic data is only available from 3 wells in the entire study area, so it's very little, and that's one of the big challenges. But the one well, which is actually a high confidence gas measurement with almost 5% hydrogen in the gas phase, shows that the isotopic deuterium range of value is in the range of what you would expect from crustal hydrogen, and that's as far as it's possible to go. So crustal, or the hydrogen, you cannot differentiate between radiolysis sourced hydrogen or serpentinization sourced hydrogen just through the deuterium isotope. So it's not possible. And also, unfortunately, any natural gas measurements in Australia, so that measured quantified methane, etc., and measured deuterium on some of the trace hydrogen, also falls into that range. So at the moment, it's not possible to get a clear distinction. So I think it's important to have all these models in mind, or these sources, and then start comparing, contrasting, like I tried to show in the last cross section. What are the criteria? Are there any criteria that differentiate one gas from another? Is one source more likely in this setting than the other? So it's a bit of a weighting exercise from what I've seen. Other noble gas or gas experts may be better at differentiating if you look at some of the co-occurring gas, but that then takes on another dimension. So looking at the other gases, CO2, nitrogen, etc., and helium is advised, and that's something we have done in the report, but it's not something I can show here.
Yeah. So your comment was, let's say, specifically for the Cooper Basin, or you mean globally? Let's say that, isotope data, I guess, are able on a global scale to distinguish between these sources, but just not in the Cooper Basin very well.
I think also globally, it's a challenge.
Still,
yes.
Okay. Okay. And there's another question. I think it's the last one for now. I'm not 100% sure if I understand the question, but it sounds to me like that basically you showed somehow how long it would take to fill a volume. What do the bacteria do? I guess the other bacteria, kind of like biodegradation of H2, or is that the question? I hope it is. Otherwise,
Yes.
Danny,
So the
speak up.
question is, I guess, can the bacteria keep up with generation, or will the bacteria, utilize any of the available hydrogen faster than it can saturate the, any setting? And I guess that is the global observation, that the microbial activity is high, that in many cases they consume all of the hydrogen unless there's some sort of focused flux against faults, with active water transport. So the examples of these hydrogen seeps, but they're very focused. But if you have, more broad aerial distribution of hydrogen, all the current studies show that any available hydrogen will be used up, and you might generate, biogenic methane, lots of other things. But that's one of the challenges. So, incorporating this sort of, let's say, bioutilization limit is important when looking at accumulation rates and so forth.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think these are the questions for now. I enjoyed the presentation. I think my highlights for me were like, you went through the different processes. You had simple, let's say, displays for the sources, and evaluating kind of intuitively with geological understanding what might be the potential sources and how can you explain what you observe, and by basically using buckets for solubility and how much is left to go through the system. I enjoyed it very much. I guess if there's anyone who wants to reach out to Alex later on, he can. He had his email address out earlier, but it was Alex. You want to repeat your email address just in case?
Yes, I'll put it in the chat real quick. It's hartwig@geosphere.com. Very simple. I'll put it in here.
Okay, perfect.
And
So if anybody wants to contact you directly,
please do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect, then. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Alex, for sharing your work with us. Before we wrap up, I would like to share a final piece of information in case you would like to learn more about the exploitation and commercialization potential of natural hydrogen. EAGE will be hosting an interactive short course on 19 to 20 May featuring Dr. Arnaud Everett. So if you're interested, you can scan the QR code currently displayed on my screen to find more details and also register. Then thank you again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Alex, a lot.